Again, I'll say as I did earlier, I'm convinced there's not a better place we could be today. The privilege we are to have awakened this morning to the first day of the week, the first day of a new year. It might have been maybe kind of a short night for some of you. As it was in my neighborhood, we have some people that are really zealous about firing off fireworks. And that's all I'll say about them. But now that we are all awake, let me ask you, how many of you have ever fallen asleep in church? 1, 2, 3. Come on, you don't want me to name names. Because I too have fallen asleep in church. Most people have. I was wondering, maybe what we need in our assemblies is what the Pilgrims used to call the tithing man. The tithing man's role in their assembly was to keep everybody awake during sermons that lasted 2 to 3 hours. Well, he had a unique way of doing this. He had a long rod that could reach in through the pews there. One end that was tipped with a brass knocker. And for those men who had fallen asleep, he'd rap them. On the other end, that was a little softer. There was perhaps a rabbit's foot or maybe a feather on that end, and he would just sort of tap the ladies who were dozing off. And maybe they were dozing off because they had stayed up too late or had to get up too early. Likely they had worked hard all week long. And truth be told, it might be that the preacher was just boring that day. But there is a need to, even when our eyes are groggy or heavy with sleep, for whatever reason, there is a need to be awakened. It has many times happened throughout the ages, several times even in this country, that people had grown so tired of the practice of religion that they were weak in their convictions, they were lax in their devotion. And so it goes and tends to get worse as it goes until something happens that shakes them. Some event comes along that just shocks them. And so, perhaps, sometimes it's been by a preacher's fiery sermon. There was the well-known sermon by Jonathan Edwards about sinners in the hands of an angry God. You ought to read that one. Maybe I ought to deliver it. I couldn't deliver it like he does. And it's one of those that probably goes for about an hour and a half. But sinners in the hands of an angry God sparked a nationwide spiritual renewal, ignited a great awakening. And there was a refreshing of religion. There was a renewing of devotion. In our country, the first great awakening happened in the 1700s. It was a return to religious fundamentalism. The second one was in the 1800s. And that gave rise to both things very good and things not good. Out of that grew the Restoration movement, of which we're blessed to be a part. Also out of that grew the multiplication of denominations. The third Great Awakening was about 1903. That was fired by Pentecostalism. The third is said to be in about 1960. People were stirred again, but that was primarily being stirred by the personality of the preachers. And so it seems with each passing awakening, while people's eyes were being opened, they weren't always being shown the truth. It's caused me to wonder, will there be another so-called awakening? Oh, there could be if people genuinely would seek to know God, genuinely be awakened to the truth by which they're enabled to see God's will for their lives. I'll dare not to predict another national awakening. But today I will dare to say that the next and the most needed awakening is in you and in me, in the church. Don't get offended by my saying that. because Jesus himself said that. We'll see that later in the last revelation to John. There's a need for an awakening in the church. So, why is that? Why did I dare to suggest that there needs to be an awakening? It is so that to the will of God, we would be as alert as some of you are after a double shot espresso grande. Or if somebody splashed icy water in your face. In a sense, spiritually speaking, we need to be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. You hadn't heard that one in a while. Bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Reinvigorated, eager to see. Because then we are able to see God. I didn't make that up either. So says Luke the physician. In Luke chapter 9, in verse 32. Our text this morning comes out of Luke chapter 9. I want to begin there in that verse. That when Jesus' disciples, when they were fully awake, there it says they saw the glory of the Lord. When they were fully awake, they saw the glory of the Lord. Now that is a great awakening, and one that is much needed. When each one who desires to follow Jesus will, as pictured there, will arise, will rub the sleep out of your eyes, to be fully awakened, even to be alert to Jesus' working. Family, I'm suggesting we need ever more clearly to see who Jesus is, to perceive what he came to do, to see better God's working through him, and most of all, to submit to his will in our lives. And therefore, I'm setting before us today a theme for 2023. And it's simply this: fully awake and able to see. Fully awake and able to see. Now, there are many places in our Bibles that call people to awaken. And when it's really urgent, often the word is repeated. It'll say, awake, awake, like right now. You need to see this. But here in Luke 9 and verse 32, in this one place, that word is unique. It's not talking about just being awake. It's talking about always being on the alert. But you got to wake up. Reminds me of Dina's Grandpa Brown. Now, Dina's Grandpa Brown always got up very early every morning. And he insisted everybody else was going to wake up too. So he'd walk through the house banging the walls. Everybody had to get up, rise and shine, get busy, get to work. Only problem is then Grandpa Brown sat down in his chair and went to sleep till breakfast was ready. Well, Luke does not have Grandpa Brown in mind here. Like when you're alert, it's time to get to work and it's time to remain on the alert. And so, all the good that the Lord seeks to accomplish in us, we need to be fully alert so that we might not miss it. And that's really what Luke means by fully awake. To be always ready with spiritual eyes wide open, because you might miss something good. All the good that is the Lord intends by working in us and changing us, you might miss. And that is why this morning we are going to the text in Luke chapter 9. There again, to the only place it says fully awake. We see that all this chapter, and really the entire gospel, the chapter is all about the change that is coming. And the change by Jesus is coming. The change that ought to be happening in us. You see, we all need to, with spiritual eyes wide open, to see Jesus. We need to see with spiritual eyes in order to become spiritual people. Now we understand that. You can't look at things the way the world sees things. have to have spiritual perception to become spiritual people. And in this, Jesus or Luke, neither one, they're not talking about just a minor tweaking of our character. They're not talking about some measure of transformation. They're talking about a radical result, a radical change of life, akin to the type which the disciples would see that day in Jesus' transfiguration. It is that change that Jesus was seen praying there in the mountain. So let's go and read about it now. We're going to start in Luke chapter 9 and in verse 28. About 8 days after he had said these things, I guess I'm going to stop there first. After he said what things? What has been said? He's referring to the things that were said beginning in chapter 9 and verse 20. There, Jesus had just asked the disciples, who do people say that I am? And it's not really a question about what everybody else says he is. Who do you say that I am? And Peter correctly answers, speaking for the 12. He says, you are the Christ of God. You are the Christ of God. Now, that's more than recognizing who he is. It's also declaring what Jesus has to suffer. Being true that because Jesus is the Christ, he must and very soon would suffer ridicule and rejection, even to be crucified on the cross. And he must be. Because the fact is, Jesus is our Savior by his death and burial. He is announced as the Christ by his glorious resurrection, by his being raised to life by God, which hopefully we understand, we need to be ever mindful of, that the same is required of those disciples. The same is true of us as well. We must be willing to suffer in like kind that death to self, that burial of our past, and that being raised to the newness of life. Certainly we must do so. And so such a process, I think we need to see more clearly, such a process of believers dying to self and being raised to life is more than a single event that might have occurred here in this baptistry or wherever you were baptized. It's not a one moment in time event. It is intended to be a continually life-changing and an entirely life-transforming process. And by such a process, we need to understand that there's no status quo in Christianity. Is there? There's not a status quo in Christianity. Now, these disciples could come to that point and they could say, well, I know enough and I've already started to follow Jesus. That's enough. He's not going to compel me to do anything else. You know, I used to say it quite often. Good enough, in the mind of many, good enough is close enough. I've come this far. He's not going to compel me to do anything more. Yes, he is. He's talking about a radical change of life. And so Jesus is causing men to see. We never come to that place where we can say, I've done enough. Or we can say, yeah, I know it says I need to do that, but I'm just not going to do it. There's no status quo in Christianity. Such a process is intended to be a radical change of life. And as we'll read it here in Luke chapter 9 and verse 25, this process is the means of profiting. The Christians profiting by their faith and their obedience is this radical transformation. Such a change is the means to great gain. And such a change was about to be seen in Jesus' appearance that day. Let's begin there again in verse 28. About 8 days after he had said these things, he took Peter and John and James into the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothing became white and gleaming. Look! 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory, and were speaking about his departure. Some translations will say there about his death or his deceasing. His departure, which was to be accomplished at Jerusalem. Peter and those with him were heavy in sleep. Can't you imagine them? It's like we talk about, sometimes you still got sand in your eyes. They're still groggy. They're heavy in sleep. When fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. And as the 2 were leaving, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwelling places, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. He did not know, he didn't understand what he was saying. And while Peter was talking, a cloud moved in and overshadowed them. The cloud covered them, and they were afraid. A voice from the cloud said, This is my beloved Son. Hear him. Listen to him. After the voice, only Jesus was with the disciples, and they were silent and told no one in those days what they had seen. Fully awake to see something no man on earth had been privileged to see, to glimpse the glory of the Christ. As Peter said in verse 33, now to be sure it was good for the disciples to see this radical change in Jesus. But there's a severe problem in their response. There's a severe problem for to any man to whom Jesus is truly our master. He's never going to tolerate worshiping 3, which is exactly what Peter is proposing. Let's build 3 dwelling places, 3 places to worship. Yes, see, it seems right to them, as it did to many Jews, yes, we ought to still worship the patriarchs. We ought to still worship the prophets. No. You see there, it's evident that, yes, they've seen the glory, but they are yet without understanding. While they were fully awake, at that moment, they're blind to the reality that there is only one master who is worthy of worship. There's only one master who is to be served. There is only one master who has the authority and the ability to save. There's only one who in himself is the true and the way to the Father. And likewise, just as Jesus himself must needs go home by the way of the cross, likewise the same is for us. We too must go home by means of our own death, burial, and resurrection. It's the only way we'll get there. And family, by our so living is to serve only the Savior, and to serve him as both Lord and Christ. There is this great day coming when indeed we will all be changed. All who remain faithful will be changed in our appearance. Can we begin to imagine that day? The sights of that day? The disciples have gone from the darkness of sleeping, which really means from spiritual ignorance. They were yet ignorant of the things they need to understand. They've gone from the darkness of sleeping to being awakened by a bright light. And there first we can imagine kind of rubbing their eyes, getting used to the light. And when at last they're fully awakened, they see the glory of God's working. And that is being magnificently displayed in the change of Jesus' appearance. They're roused from darkness to radiant light, and then in a moment then they're under the shadow of darkness again. What a shock it must have been. You see, they were, in effect, by their lack of understanding, they were, in effect, still sitting in darkness. And those without understanding, they are under the shadow of death. Even though Jesus has revealed himself and what he was before he came to earth and what he will be again, they're without understanding. But thankfully, the remedy had already been foretold. We find the remedy back in Luke chapter 1. In Luke chapter 1, in the prophecy of the coming birth of John the prophet and the message that he will bring to the people, we see the remedy. Chapter 1, verse 77. Why did John the prophet come? To give knowledge of salvation to his people, whereby the sunrise shall visit us. That's powerful. Whereby God's tender mercy, how it will be seen. He says, whereby the sunrise shall visit us. For those who are sitting in darkness, you see what's happening? The sunrise will come. He shall visit us from on high to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace. Now what a sight it is to see there. Verse 78, the sunrise. The sunrise refers to the risen Son of God. Pictured is the shadow of death being removed by the sunrise to life. It is declared by the voice, "This is my Son, my chosen one. Listen to him." Now, wait a minute, just for the sake of argument. You mean it's not enough to see Jesus? It's not enough by the study of the Word or by some experience of our own to have this impression that we've seen Jesus? And they actually had seen his glory. You know, it's often true that seeing is believing. Isn't that enough? No. What's the voice from the cloud say? Listen to him. In a sense, have your ears opened as wide as your eyes. Listen to him. Implying into no one else. For now, we know from Hebrews chapter 1 and other places, we know from Jesus' own testimony that he speaks only the words he was given to speak. In Hebrews 1 and verse 1, we're reminded that in these last days, God has spoken to us through his Son. And there we are in that same passage reminded. He is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of God's nature, who upholds all things by the word of his power. Listen to him. Listen to him. And no one else. Worship him and no one else. Awaken to see Christ and no one else. Come out of the shadows to both see and to obey the one who has come to save us. It must have been a glorious sight. The change in Jesus' appearance. From the one who had humbly come, the one who must and would very soon suffer ridicule and rejection and even to death on the cross, and then to be glorified as the Christ in his resurrection. These men have been privileged indeed to have already foreseen. They have foreseen his radiant transfiguration. The Son of God is being changed from glory to glory. Yes, he came from glory. He left all that behind to come to earth. But now in everything he accomplishes on the earth, he has been changed from glory to glory. I hope that we're able to see better, including me. To see Jesus' teaching, the power in it, to see it again. That because Jesus is the Christ, he must suffer. The fact is, we as his disciples must also suffer in a manner very much akin to his. We know of it from Romans chapter 6, verses 3 and 4. There where Paul is talking to Christians, reminding them of how it is that they became children of God. In that process of dying to self, burying the past, being raised to the newness of life. You see, again, it's not something that happens as a one-time event. It's entirely intended to be completely life-changing, entirely life-transforming. Again, there is no status quo in Christianity. Such a process does bring about in us a radical change of life, a change of purpose, change in nature. Not just a little tweaking, but a radical change. And it is, as Luke writes there in chapter 9, verse 25, this is the means of profiting. Yes, you might see him, you might listen to him, but it's allowing that to be effective in your own life. This is the means of profiting. As the Apostle Paul will say in 1 Timothy 6 and verse 6, such godliness is the means to great gain. Eternally, the means to gain in Christ's glory. I hope this year that we will better sense our continuing need to see Jesus for who he is, and our need to listen to him. So we need to be on the alert, seeing and obeying him always. I told you at the beginning of the lesson, I didn't make this up. Jesus said so. We find it in Revelation 16 and verse 15. In that last revelation to John, in that which John has written for all the saints. Revelation 16 and verse 15. Blessed is the one who stays awake. In other words, the one who remains on high alert and keeps on his clothes. You see, there in the last revelation, there is a reminder that presently the most needed reawakening in Christians is in Christians. You think about their situation there. Persecuted severely. The situation would be if they step out of their house, they dare not mention Christ. Does it sound like this world today? Does it sound like what is coming to be so? To be fully awake. Because when Christ returns, there will be one more great awakening. And there will be, for the faithful, a radical change in our appearance. I hope this year we're better prepared, fully awake, and able to see. To that end, what do we need to see today? Just briefly from this lesson. See the need to listen to him, to obey what he has brought forth in the gospel, what is revealed to sinners, how to be pleasing to God, how to know that peace. The invitation song asks us to make a decision. Jesus is asking the same there in Luke chapter 9. Who do men say that I am? Yeah, they got it right. Yes, we could answer that question correctly, couldn't we? But what about the rest of that? We must be prepared, ready, alert to give an answer. May, as you have need this morning, may you respond to this invitation song. What shall it be?